Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to our Fellows Public Talk today. I'm Claudia Rizzini, Executive Director of the Fellowship Program at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. Before I introduce the speaker today, as usual, I would like to invite everyone to ask questions. You can submit your questions by using the Slido link, which is posted here on the side of this room for the fellows here with us, and in the chat feature of the Zoom webinar for our online audience. You should feel free to submit your questions at any time throughout the program, and we will address them at the end of the talk. Thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce Kerri Greenidge, our Frieda L. Miller Fellow. At a young age, Kerri's grandfather told her stories about local Black history, driving up and down Route 2 in his Cadillac and pointing out little-known facts about the region's African-descended communities. A World War II veteran and Virginia native, he taught Kerri and her sisters to question popular narratives that relegate Black people and communities to the sidelines. Years later, this truism informed Kerri's work as a historian and scholar. Using biography paired with meticulous archival research, Kerri illuminates Black history that is often overlooked in American memory and has reverberating impact on contemporary society. In her most recent book, The Grimke's The Legacy of Slavery in an American Family, Kerri's landmark biography tells the story of the legendary abolitionists, the Grimke sisters, reclaiming the forgotten history of the Black members of their family. Kerri offers a corrective of the Grimke family history that foregrounds the crucial contributions of the Black Grimkes to abolitionism, education, and activism. Through this family history, she charts how physical and emotional traumas travel through generations and invites us to reevaluate the stories we tell about families and our communities. Kerri's roots in New England run deep, from her maternal grandparents, who were civil rights activists in the South End, to her parents. Her father was a graduate of Harvard who played in the famous Harvard-Yale game of 1968, and her mother has been a social worker in the great Boston and Cambridge area for 50 years. Radcliffe seems a fitting place to be as Kerri works to complete her forthcoming book, The Black New England. Told through 5 interwoven biographies, Kerri illuminates how Black New Englanders have actively influenced the policies and politics of white reformers and activists, placing their work at the center of the rise of anti-slavery and progressive legacies of the New Deal. This account counters the prevailing understanding of New England as a white space, where African-descended communities have had little effects on the contemporary political and social landscape. The Q&A portion of the public talk today will be moderated by Brandon Terry. Brandon is a Joint Foundation Fellow here at the Radcliffe Institute and Associate Professor of the Social Sciences here at Harvard University. And now please join me in welcoming Kerri Greenidge.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Thank you. Before I get started, I have a huge thank you to my Tufts crew who dragged themselves here, and I know you're all very busy, and to my sister who is in the midst of raising 2 very ornery teenagers and heading the theater department at Boston University and managed to make it here. So thank you for coming. During the 18th century, Charlestown, Massachusetts was brimming with galena. It saturated the soil and penetrated mineral deposits on the banks of the Charles River. Also referred to as black lead, galena could be ground into a white powder and mixed with water to create a glaze that gave Charlestown, Massachusetts pottery its signature veneer. Much like arsenic, another mineral produced and mixed by 18th century potters on Charlestown's waterfront, galena is a powerful poison when it is ingested. Mark, Phyllis, and Phoebe, enslaved to the wealthy merchant John Codman, knew this fact, as did other black people, free and unfree, in Charlestown and Boston. And because small amounts do not produce the immediate swelling and violent vomiting of acute arsenic poisoning, galena can remain undetected in the system long after a person dies. When Phyllis poured a vial of galena into John Codman's food, however, she used so much that remnants of the lead were visible when the coroner cut him open. Mark, Phyllis, and Phoebe were arrested and brought to the colonial court in Cambridge, where they were charged and convicted of petty treason, the only time in Massachusetts history that people were executed for this very specific crime. Codified in the English common law in 1351, petty treason was specifically designed to preserve the, quote, great chain of being, supposedly sanctioned by divine law during the Middle Ages. In colonial New England, as in Old England, petty treason was an offense committed by a social inferior against a social superior, including a servant who killed their master, a wife who killed her husband, or, quote, any ecclesiastical person, his superior, to whom he owes faith and obedience, end quote. As enslaved people of African descent who conspired with their fellow black Bostonians, both unfree and quasi-free, Mark and Phyllis committed the ultimate act of treason in a colonial Atlantic world built on Indian removal, slavery, and the slave trade. They killed the man who owned them. The English common law also described exactly how Mark and Phyllis should pay for their crime. The two were dragged to Gallows Hill in Cambridge, located roughly near Lancaster and Linnaean Streets in today's Porter Square. There, Phyllis was burned alive and Mark was hung. But what happened next was neither a part of common law nor a provision in the colonial court. Mark's dead body was transported to Charlestown Common, over 4 miles away, where he was gibbeted, a form of medieval spectacle that resulted in his mutilated body being hung in chains for all to see. This is an image of the Cambridge Common. The hanging would have been in the distance. This is a map of Boston and Cambridge. The arrow points to where the gallows would have been, and this is where the gallows were in the colonial map. Mark's remains were still there over 20 years later when Paul Revere took his famous midnight ride from Lexington in 1775. By then, Mark's execution and mutilation were so ingrained in local consciousness that Revere mentioned it merely as a landmark, a site not unlike the old elms on Cambridge Common that provided scenery for Revere's triumphant ride to Boston. The historian Gloria Whiting has recently told us that the story of Mark, Phyllis, and Phoebe illustrates how, quote, the actions taken by people of African descent to fortify their splintered families played a pivotal role in bringing about the sudden and poorly understood collapse of slavery in Massachusetts, end quote. This truism is illustrated by the fact that Mark was enslaved by Codman in Charlestown across the river by ferry from his wife who lived in Boston. Mark demanded that Codman sell him to someone in Boston so that he could be closer to his family. And when Codman refused, Phyllis set fire to Codman's warehouse, hoping that the cost to repair over 6,000 pounds worth of damage would force Codman to sell the 3 enslaved people to Boston. By demanding rights to family and kin, and thus to a radical freedom that was unimaginable to their enslavers, Black New Englanders understood that they were in a state of what the historian Vincent Brown refers to as perpetual war. The enslaved in Jamaica participated in this war through coordinated armed rebellion and marronage. Black New Englanders, enslaved in a majority white landscape that was not conducive to marronage, waged war through poison and arson. White New Englanders saw both forms of black protest as radically subversive, a fact illustrated by the fact that the gibbet for petty treason was never sanctioned by English common law nor recommended by the Massachusetts court during Mark and Phyllis's sentencing. Mark, Phyllis, and Phoebe were part of a broader Black New England community, both enslaved and quasi-free, whose radical demands for freedom undermined the slave society in which they lived. The white majority never yielded to their demands. After all, Mark and Phyllis were executed. Phoebe was sold to the West Indies. Mark and Phyllis were executed. Phoebe was sold to the West Indies, and slavery did not end in Massachusetts until the 1780s. But liberal New Englanders, marinating in the Atlantic Enlightenment of George Whitefield and Thomas Paine, responded as good liberals have continued to respond to Black radical protest. By ending the legal basis for slavery, patting themselves on the back for a job well done, and enacting reforms that had little effect on the material lives of the Black people amongst whom they lived. This might be why the scholar Robin D.G. Kelly says that Black radical freedom dreams argue against liberalism. Kelly states, quote, "The liberal framework has been a disaster because liberalism is that which was used against radical abolitionist movements to get them to shut up," end quote. Massachusetts eventually ended slavery, which allowed New England's 19th century reformers to disown their complicity in America's founding racial project. And here I'm borrowing a term from the historian Joanne Mellish. But since the opposite of slavery is not freedom, and because Mark and Phyllis's radical community demands for Black autonomy and self-determination were ignored, Black New Englanders continued to fight a perpetual war against the economic degradation, racial injustice, and colonial exploitation wrought by the region's liberal politics. It is this reality that I seek to explore in my new book project. In this project, I argue that Black New England's radical community protest tradition shaped the liberal ethos that characterizes the region's politics to this day. Black radical New Englanders, of course, did not demand liberal reform as an answer to slavery, colonialism, and eventually fascism. This is because, as Kelly explains further, Black radicals, quote, "cannot be bought or convinced or tricked into thinking that liberalism equals freedom," end quote. For every Black radical protest in the region's history, white New England has reacted with liberal reforms that have, in turn, shaped the liberal politics of the American experiment, both domestically and abroad. By centering Black people in the liberal political history of a region that is too often understood as exclusively white, I do not engage in hagiography that exalts the superior politics of the Adamses, Charles Sumner, the Kennedys, or Tip O'Neill. Ralph Waldo Emerson might have espoused the notion of New England exceptionalism, exalting the region's, quote, "independence, productive power, and northern acuteness of mind that is hostile to oppression," end quote. But this is not my concern. Like their brethren across the diaspora, Black New England was interested in challenging the region's liberal reputation rather than reifying it. And by centering Black radicals in our history of New England, we challenge basic assumptions about the history of American liberalism as a whole. Black New England tells the story of Black radical community rebellion through intertwined biographies of, sorry to say, it's now extended to 8 Black New Englanders from the era of Mark and Phyllis through the anti-colonial struggles of post-World War II America. Biography might be the third rail of the historical profession, as one critic has said, but it is through the complexities of a single life and the interaction between that life and the broader community of which it is a part that the Black radical roots of New England liberalism can be seen. For a political and cultural ideology that has become both maligned and cherished in the public consciousness, liberalism, like liberal, is difficult to define. Most recently, the historian Helena Rosenblatt has asked us to look beyond the themes of individual rights and social justice to the importance of, quote, duties, generosity, moral probity, and civic values, end quote. Shaped in 18th century Germany, but invented by France in the early 19th century, liberalism did not emerge in the United States until the early 20th century. Even then, as Rosenblatt states, the notion of individual rights were not central to American liberalism until the rise of totalitarianism and the dawn of the Cold War. Yet scholars of Black history and politics, like the historian Nathan Connolly and more recently Kedrick Roy right here at Harvard, they note that the African American liberal tradition emerged much earlier. For Connolly during the rise of Jim Crow in the postbellum American South, and for Roy in the early 19th century activism of antebellum Black communities. Black New England takes Rosenblatt, Connolly, Roy, and other intellectual historians to heart, while also pointing out that liberalism has been particularly entrenched in New England's political psyche. There is a reason that early 20th century scholars like Van Wyck Brooks and F.O. Matheson examine New England's 19th century culture and politics as a microcosm of American exceptionalism more generally. The Puritan founding, the revolutionary battles of Lexington and Concord, the antebellum anti-slavery movement and progressive era labor reforms, the signal role of area universities and businesses in the liberal consensuses of the 20th century, all of these, and every time liberal politics and policy have triumphed in America, New England people and institutions have been there. This is one of the reasons that the term New England liberal, maligned by many and self-righteously proclaimed by others, maintains a stronghold on American political economy, despite the dwindling electoral significance of the region and America's rapid demographic shift to the Sun Belt. In defining and historicizing liberalism, I am also interested in defining and historicizing Blackness. When the first Africans arrived in Boston during the 1630s, they were a diasporic people, already familiar, as the historian Jared Hardesty shows us, with slavery and unfreedom across the Atlantic world. Africans in other parts of British America came as Atlantic Creoles from specific regions in Africa and the Caribbean, the Coromantee and Akan in Jamaica, for instance, or those from the Senegambia region of Africa who arrived in Dutch New York. Yet those Puritan enslavers who the Puritan enslavers called Negroes came from a variety of places in the Atlantic world, which gave New England's Black community a particularly diverse ethnic history. Certainly by the 18th century, Black New Englanders were as likely to come from Antigua and Barbados, where Mark was born, as they were from Madagascar, Bermuda, and the western coast of Africa itself. Additionally, given the brutality of the Puritan project in New England, these Africans worked and lived alongside Wampanoag and Pequot people, who were both the first people in the region and the first to resist Puritan enslavement. By the end of the Revolutionary War, intermarriage and kinship between Africans and indigenous people meant that Blackness in New England was intertwined with Native communities. Boston's Hosea Easton, Rhode Island's Eleanor Eldridge, New Bedford's Cuffey family, Black New Englanders proudly claimed their Africanness, which often included Wampanoag, Mashpee, and Pequot ancestry, a racial understanding that shaped the radical ways that Black communities challenged slavery and its afterlives. Any history of Black people in New England then necessarily includes the Afro-Native histories of Blackness described by historians like Taya Miles and Kendra Field. Similarly, Cape Verdeans and West Indians, with their historic ties to New England slaveholding and trading, have been part of Black communities in Massachusetts and Rhode Island and across New England itself since the whaling economy of the early 19th century. Any discussion of Black people in the region then must account for the fact that foreign-born people of African descent have constituted at least 10% of Massachusetts' Black population since the first federal census of 1790. Thus, my book defines Blackness as the people in Black communities defined it, from the Afro-Wampanoag, quote-unquote, Negroes of the early Republic to the West Indian and South American, quote-unquote, colored people of the 20th century. I begin the book by examining the lives of two Black New Englanders, one enslaved and one free, whose successful 18th century freedom suits challenged slavery in Massachusetts. While historians continue to debate when and how slavery eventually ended in the Bay State, here I am less concerned with how white New Englanders define Black freedom and more concerned with the radical demands of Black freedom seekers, which were often never fulfilled. Jenny Slew was one of the dozens of enslaved people who filed freedom suits in Massachusetts between 1700 and 1783. And although the historical record is frustratingly silent when it comes to details of her life, her immersion within the unfree community of Essex County, Massachusetts, indicates how Black communities mobilized around radical demands for freedom, even as white patricians debated over freedom's meaning. Jenny Slew was born in Ipswich around the same time as Mark, although there is no indication that they knew each other. It is possible, however, that Slew knew about Mark, Phyllis, and Phoebe and the petty treason that sent them to Gallows Hill. As a free person who called herself a mulatto, Slew worked in the homes of wealthy merchants and traders who traveled frequently to Boston and Charlestown during the 1750s when Mark's body hung as a landmark on Charlestown Common. In 1765, Slew sued John Whipple Jr. of Ipswich for holding her captive in this home seen here, which is still standing in Ipswich, Massachusetts. and held her in this house, as you see here. Whipple was part of a respected and influential family in Ipswich, Salem, and Cambridge who kidnapped Slew, who was legally free, and forced her to work in this home. Slew won the case, and she won her freedom. Slew versus Whipple did not lead to slavery's legal end across colonial Massachusetts. The plaintiff's attorney, John Kent, argued that because her mother was white, Slew could not be legally enslaved, and that was the grounds for why she was eventually freed. But as one of many cases filed by enslaved New Englanders in the decade before the Revolution, Slew's use of the court system, supported by her ties to the tightly knit black community of Ipswich and its surrounding areas, helped shape similar claims by black New Englanders that were eventually successful in challenging the constitutional basis for slavery in Massachusetts. It was because of the legal precedent set by Jenny Slew and other black women that Quock Walker, born in 1754, was able to launch his own freedom suit in the 1780s. Much like the black community that nurtured Jenny Slew in Ipswich, the small yet closely knit community of black people in central Massachusetts nurtured Quock Walker's radical claims to freedom. Quock Walker was promised his freedom, then mercilessly beaten after he fled to the home of the white Caldwell family in Barre, Massachusetts, that you see here. While Walker's suit against the Worcester County enslaver Nathaniel Jennison led to slavery's end across the Commonwealth and enacted the liberal notion of judicial review, which we can talk about in the talkback, Walker and his community's radical vision of black self-determination were thwarted by the liberal anti-slavery of white legislators. Walker's descendants became property holders and abolitionists in Boston and Cambridge, but late 18th century liberal anti-slavery, by ignoring black radical demands, never accounted for the economic reparation and self-determination required for actual black liberation. This is the site of the Walker family cemetery that still exists in Barre, Massachusetts. Walker died with neither the land nor the cultural capital to fully participate in the body politic from which he and his brethren were initially excluded. Black nation building was the principal concern of the next section of the book and the next section of the biographies. Here I discuss both David Walker and Robert Benjamin Lewis, whose reappropriation of the language in 18th century freedom suits argued for global black revolution and Pan-Africanist philosophy. In the second chapter of the book, I use their intertwined biographies to show how both men's immersion in an inherently cosmopolitan, ethnically diverse, free black community nurtured their demands for a self-determined, autonomous, and economically independent black world that defied the white supremacist basis for slavery and empire. While reformers like William Lloyd Garrison responded to these radical black visions of slave rebellion and nationhood by arguing for slavery's immediate end and America's moral reform, while both Walker and Lewis participated in the anti-slavery movement, their radicalism nurtured a black political consciousness more concerned with black-led slave rebellion, self-determination, and an end to racial determinism than narrow ideas of freedom. While the contours of David Walker's life are well known, due to the early work of Henry Highland Garnett and a 1997 biography by the historian Peter Hinks, scholars often assume that the scope and sophistication of Walker's 1829 appeal owe more to his decades of travel rather than to the black Boston community in which he lived. But I argue, through an examination of Walker's family and kinship ties, that the scope and sophistication of Walker's radical abolitionism was informed by the ethnically and culturally diverse black community of Greater Boston, particularly his relationships with those who were raised in families and communities at the center of freedom suits. The fact that Walker's compatriots in the black-led Massachusetts General Colored Association were raised in families and communities that participated in these suits, including Quock Walker's nephew, who became a big confidant of David Walker. This indicates that Walker's emancipatory vision was more allied with radical notions of justice and moral responsibility than the freedom and individual rights espoused by many white reformers. It is no coincidence, then, that the Massachusetts General Colored Association published the work of Afro-Native ethnographer Robert Benjamin Lewis in 1836. Robert Lewis was born in Maine, the son of an enslaved African and a woman of Afro-Native descent. Lewis's Light and Truth was the first ethnographic study by a person of color in the United States. An early Pan-Africanist and founder of black liberation theology, Lewis's life and writing, like Walker's appeal, became the basis for a black radical language that challenged the growing field of racial science. As white liberals adopted the polygenicism of Francis Galton and Louis Agassiz, black radicals used the ethnographic ideas espoused by Robert Lewis to counter Western claims of Anglo-Saxon racial superiority. By the end of the Civil War, black New Englanders with political ideals rooted in black-led radical tradition of David Walker and people like Robert Lewis, they pushed their white Republican legislators to uphold the legal and political concept of consent of the governed, the philosophical basis for the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. Black New England's faith in the constitutional viability of consent of the governed was the culmination over a century of their radical abolitionist activism. Historians have traditionally traced consent of the governed to the republicanism of John Locke and the Reconstruction policies of anti-slavery senators Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens. But I locate this concept in the radical movement for racial equality waged by black New Englanders in the decades straddling American Civil War and Reconstruction. Unlike white politicians who saw consent of the governed as the legal enactment of 18th century Republican notions of individual rights, black New Englanders, like freed people across the recently emancipated South, saw the concept of consent of the governed as a tool for black radical liberation rather than an end game in and of itself. Their demands for reparative justice and racial self-determination frightened neo-abolitionist white New Englanders who, in the words of David Walker's son Edwin Garrison Walker, love freedom but are not so sure about the Negro, end quote. Acting against the radical demands of black New Englanders like Edwin Garrison Walker, George T. Downing, and Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, who envisioned transnational, economically self-determinative, and armed black communities as the logical fulfillment of freedom's promise, white New Englanders spent the long racial nadir shaping economically and racially exploitative liberal Republican policy at home and abroad. All three of the black New Englanders in this section of the book have family and kinship ties to 18th century enslaved communities, antebellum radical abolitionists, and the transnational African diaspora that characterized the region at the turn of the 20th century. The son of David Walker, Edwin Garrison Walker, was raised in Charlestown, mere blocks from the Codman estate, where Mark, Phyllis, and Phoebe waged their perpetual war in 1755. His mother was the child of formerly enslaved black people who sued for their freedom in the 1780s, while his stepfather was a seaman whose travels to Hawaii, the Caribbean, and Central America informed his stepson's conceptualization of global black resistance. As such, Edwin Garrison Walker saw black political independence and alliance with the economically and racially oppressed as the only route toward radical liberation. Elected state legislator from a predominantly poor Irish Catholic district in Massachusetts, Walker's demands for economic justice fell on deaf ears, even as the Massachusetts legislature adopted liberal reforms to appease a rising labor movement in which Walker was extremely active. George T. Downing also understood blackness as a global consciousness composed of people across a wide diaspora. His own wife was the daughter of a man from Calcutta, India, and a woman of Dutch New York descent. But Downing's de Grasse in-laws identify with the antebellum free black communities of New York and New England. As a confidant to Massachusetts Senators Charles Sumner, Downing advised radical Republicans on how to make consent of the governed a law of the land through the 14th Amendment and the 1875 Civil Rights Act. But like most in his radical black community, Downing did not see these pieces of liberal legislation as the end of black liberation. As he said, "I see them as a means." After Sumner's death, Downing was holding the senator's hand when he died. The Rhode Island activist and restaurateur joined Edwin Walker and other black political independents as they fought to make economic justice and racial liberation the cornerstone of civil rights, rather than mere, as he called it, the emptiness and promise of being around white folk. Here he is with his family. Josephine Ruffin was the child of a black man of Native American and Martinician descent, and a white woman from England. Her husband, George L. Ruffin, was the first black man appointed to a judgeship in the United States and also a Harvard Law School graduate. Yet even as her husband served honorably in the Charlestown District Court, Josephine Ruffin raised her 5 children in a world of neo-abolitionist reform, women's rights, and public service. After her husband died, however, Ruffin became increasingly disillusioned with the limitations of white feminists, with whom she worked in the American Women's Suffrage Association. By the 1890s, she founded Women's Era, the first Black woman-owned newspaper in the country, through which she hoped to nurture a global Black community with women at its center. Like Walker and Downing, by the dawn of the 20th century, Ruffin was so disappointed by white liberals' perversion of radical Black freedom dreams that she largely disappeared from public life. The radical Black consciousness envisioned by Edwin Garrison Walker, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, and George T. Downing did not materialize, but white New England's reaction to its threat, like the reaction of their liberal forefathers, shaped progressive era federal policy and empire. As Robin Kelley also tells us, of course, this did nothing for the actual liberation or demands of actual Black people. But 20th century Black New Englanders channeled the radical freedom dreams of their 19th century predecessors to link Black liberation to global struggles against capitalist empire and fascism. The last part of the book uses the life and radical politics of Boston editors Eugene Gordon and William Worthy to establish the centrality of Black New England in the radical labor rights and anti-colonial struggles of the 20th century. Eugene Gordon's leadership of the New England branch of the John Reed Club and Worthy's federal court fight against Cold War suppression of radical dissent were rejected by New England progressives and their liberal New Deal children. But both men's writings and activism, based in an ethnically diverse Black Boston community, informed the radical demands of Black activists across the diaspora. While liberals in the federal government and in New England state houses suppressed the radical instincts of the region's small yet internationally significant Black community, both Worthy and Gordon reclaimed the freedom dreams of their predecessors for a new generation of Black activists who were less concerned with integration and more enamored of global anti-capitalism, third world liberation, and an end to the rise of America's carceral state. So, why does this all matter? After the publication of my first two books, I was often asked this at all of my book talks. It's a question that no scholar likes to confront, and although it is something that nobody wants to think about, it has made me particularly conscious of the fact that centering Black lives and communities is controversial to most people. Political pundits and social theorists, particularly in this election season, love to reduce Black people and communities to numbers on an electoral map or a social issue to be debated. As such, the depths and diversity of Black communities are ignored in favor of an imagined monolith that fits either the progressive optimism of the center-left or the irrational racial fears of the right. It is my hope that this book will make a contribution, however small, to the idea that Blackness is a nation and that its nuanced politics and radical possibilities constantly make and remake the political foundations upon which we all stand. Black freedom dreams might continue unfulfilled, but as Cedric Robinson tells us, if we are to move the radical tradition forward, it is imperative that we understand that it is not utopian. I will conclude with Robinson's quote, as he states, "The radical tradition is about questing for freedom. It is about the necessity of recognizing the importance of struggle, regardless of outcomes. Nor does it begin and end intellectually. We must look beyond the straitjackets of race to understand common histories in order to make common sense." Thank you. Thanks. Hello, Brandon. Oh, no.
Already breaking stuff. Kerri, thank you so much for this fascinating, wonderful talk. You're one of my favorite historians working today, and every time I hear you, I feel like I learn something that I had no idea about before. And one of the things I really appreciate about your work is that you're always introducing those of us who work in a tradition of political philosophy, political theory, to new figures or figures that we've overlooked. And it's just another extraordinary example of that.
Thank you.
And that it puts me in the mind of one question immediately, which is about a question of method. So I think someone like me watching the talk is like, why don't we know more about these kinds of people, right? Like, it's never even really occurred. I've taught David Walker for 15 years. And I confess, I've never really thought much about his son. And what did he think, and how was this tradition carried on? And it strikes me that you get there by way of biography and by way of a certain kind of historical investigation based on biography. So could you just say a little bit more about the way you're trying to bridge kind of intellectual history, history of political thought, and social and cultural history through biography?
Well, thank you for the question. I really believe that Black people and communities, like all communities, you can often get at the essence of big political questions, transnational questions, racial questions, by looking at actual people where they are and how those big questions specifically interact with where that particular person, their community, their space. And it allows, I think biography allows us to acknowledge that, you know, an experience of someone like a William Worthy in Boston and Harlem and eventually China, where he goes in the 1950s, is very different than even, say, Malcolm X, who's raised in Omaha and in the Midwest, and then comes to Boston. Right. And they might still come to the same political conclusions. But when you take into the account biography and take into account the communities in which those people marinate and kind of come to their conclusions, biography allows you, I think, a deeper way of looking at political thought and then how that politics is enacted.
Yeah. And I think it does do a thing about really tracking people's evolution over time in a way that I think other studies of political philosophy don't necessarily do really that well. Okay, so another thing that really struck me about the talk is this, you know, I'm one of these people, a transplant.
Yes, yes.
Right, so I come up here from Baltimore, and to put it bluntly, I am struck by the liberal ethos of the place. Baltimore, Mid-Atlantic has its own kind of liberal thing, but it's a working class, ethnic white liberalism. It's not like up here.
Yeah.
And so I am a little hesitant.
Yes.
Right. So
you and I talked about this yesterday.
Yeah. So when you end on the thing and you say, well, people say, so what? There's a part of me that has a kind of Nietzschean response. It's like, well, what is history for? And when we tell these kind of stories and we're so critical, do we lose something? Do we lose something of the New England exceptionalism that maybe all the liberalism is, you know, not perfect or has these blind spots, but maybe it's the best we have. And that too harsh a criticism leaves us bereft of cultural resources to reconstruct something more powerful. That at least on all the biggest issues, New England liberals were on the right side. How would you respond to somebody who says something like that?
I knew you were going to ask this. I would say I completely agree with you. I would say that to agree with that notion, we also have to take into account how that liberal ethos develops. And we have to take into account that liberalism at every turn, it's valuable to look at the works of Black radical theorists like Robin Kelley or, you know, who are basically arguing that conversation, that liberal conversation, is not built to actually deliver the demands that radical Black communities have often had. It's just not structured to do that, right? And that's not to say that liberal ethos and a liberal promise is somehow defective and you got to throw it out. It's more to argue perhaps to get that liberal tradition, liberal reform to affect the most people is to take into account the radical demands that communities are making of it, right? Even if you recognize that that system can't possibly deliver, right? And so I actually think it's more of an optimistic way of looking at this ethos and this politics, because you have the constant pressure and constant activism of people who have a specific vision of what liberation looks like. And even though the politics of a liberal society might almost get there, it doesn't get there right away, but right, that's the purpose of sort of radicalism. That's why I end with Cedric Robinson, right? It's like it's not utopian. There's never going to be a utopia. There's never going to be an Eden, but it is a way that you're forcing those demands onto the center stage. So I would not disagree with you at all, but I would say that the fact that radical claims by Black communities exist and that often there's a liberal response that then creates a system that is an ideal, and as you're saying, on the right side of history. It still means that Black radicalism has a completely relevant place in the way that we talk about liberal political economy.
So, I was struck in your talk, particularly towards the end, you kept coming back to the question of Black demands for self-determination. And these are like notoriously a problem for liberalism. In part because liberals tend to insist on the importance of the inviolable dignity of the individual. Freedom of association. So they have a concern that people will be subjected to arbitrary domination or interference by forms of association that they didn't choose. So when people start talking in the language of group rights, that we're going to have Black schools or Black controlled neighborhoods or Black community controlled law enforcement, there is a worry, and liberal feminists raise this worry about, well, what does it mean for women to be subjected to this? Queer theorists in the liberal tradition raise this worry. What does it mean for people non-normative sexualities to be? So I guess to put the question pointedly, are liberals, at least on their own grounds, justified in rejecting anything that Black radicals demand?
Oh, this is an interesting question. I would say yes, but I would also say that, the Black radical community's demands are often the very things that liberal non-Black communities already exist with. So if you take, for example, someone like a David Walker, his vision is for armed Black Black slave resistance across the Atlantic world. He also was very big on the fact that Black communities should control, this rise of education and churches and all that type of thing. But he's working at a time when that was the status quo for the majority for all of white people in the Boston that he lived in. So my question would be, and I think the radical question of the Black community would be, why can't we have a similar thing, right? And have a control over our own destiny and our own determination. I would also argue that, perhaps members of this Black radical tradition, although I don't talk about them specifically in my book, because my editor would lose her mind by adding more people in, is that perhaps the people within a Black radical tradition who should be listened to are the people who are the queer people and the most maligned group within that radical tradition. So I wouldn't say that, the Black Panthers are right, or Back to Africa movements of the 1920s are right. I'm more interested in what does it mean that a community influences an individual, and an individual then manages to drive a conversation and drive a policy that then that policy might not do all the things that they want, right? But nevertheless, their radical question has power.
Oh, that's really helpful. And it speaks to a thing you talked about a bit, about liberalism and its association with faith and progress. That maybe that's one way that liberals try to square the circle. I do want to get to some of other people's questions, because I could ask you questions all day. Yes. But there is one that comes up that's trying to connect your analysis of this long tradition to the present. And it's asking about current examples of white liberalism. And I think part of what's driving the question is to get you to clarify some about what exactly you who's included in your category of liberalism and how we might track it over time. So they're asking, what are some current examples of white liberalism, and how do these particular liberal values manifest in progressive movements? And how might they be in tension with Black radical demands?
So it's a good question. I think that presently the notion that the inquiry and education and conversation is enough. I think that's kind of a very much a moment we're in at the moment, right? If we just kind of have a talk to people who we disagree with politically, or if we just happen to sort of have this debate and have this, this conversation, that at the end of that conversation is going to be something that liberal-minded people want to see happen. Yeah. So if you have a conversation about, the border, for instance, a liberal conversation would be, we keep on having this conversation, eventually the other person's gonna come to reason, right? And they're gonna come around to my view, right? That's kind of a thing that people believe. I don't know how much we're living in, or how much that is the case in certain dynamics. And I particularly would argue that a Black radical ethos would be the answer to why you can't have that conversation, right? William Worthy would say, you can't have a conversation about Black people having the right to live in houses without rats in them, right? That's not a conversation that you can debate with somebody, right? So the very notion that you're having an argument in the 1960s about housing might require that a liberal ethos listen to a community for whom housing is actually a life or death thing. It's not sort of just a policy. It's not something that just has to do with, perhaps if we get some piece of legislation that this is the way to do it. It kind of has to take into account the demands of that actual community. So I think in terms of today, I think this project, and I think one of the questions to ask is, like, at what point do we argue that we can't debate over people or a community's humanity?
Yeah.
That needs to be kept off the table, yeah. Right? And so when you're having conversations about housing, or like the current rental crisis in a place like Massachusetts and New England, you're talking about the fact that people don't have a place to live. Like, that has to be the bottom, that has to be the radical thing from which you move. It shouldn't be a conversation about, I think that we make an error when it is a conversation about, well, I don't want to have the tea going through my community, and so I'm gonna organize my community to protest. We're gonna be the one community in Greater Boston that doesn't have sort of these tea acts concerning rent, right? And that doesn't mean that we're bad people, it just means that we don't want the tea in our neighborhood, right? And so I think at every turn, a question that radicalism asks, that I think in many cases a liberal ethos does not ask, is it's putting the humanity of kind of the community and at the center, right? As opposed to these abstract questions of right and policy. Yeah. If that makes sense.
No, it's really useful. Just a really quick follow-up. So if you think liberalism has a fetish for consensus arrived at through deliberation or communication, is your sense of the Black radical response then that, so a couple ways you might go at it. One is that you can't do that because ideology structures the conversation too much, that there's people who can no longer reason because they're so in the grip of white supremacy. Or is it something structural that, like, conversation can't happen, we can't really reason about this because capitalism too structures the possibilities of what we can debate about? Or is it something more political, like we can't deliberate about it because it's too urgent and we need to turn to coercion, whether that's civil disobedience, mass strikes, political violence? I'm just trying to track for you where the nub of the resistance to liberal fetish for conversation is.
Well, I wouldn't say it's a resistance. I would say it's more of, I think a black radical imagination would say, or would ask, who is having the conversation? And the fact that who is having the conversation structures and the possibilities that you see based on the policies that you're discussing, right? So in the example of the T, or the argument, Communities Act, which occurs here in Massachusetts. What does it mean that you can have a fake debate amongst a very small group of people about not wanting the T or the train coming into their community? What would it actually look like if you had people who take the T and who are unhoused and who live in that area come in and have the conversation about what it actually means once, the effects that this will have on actually their lives? And I don't see that. I see that sometimes happening particularly in this moment, in a very superficial way. But I don't really see it happening in a way that's actually conducive to getting something done. I think it's kind of becomes cosmetic. And so my argument would be is that a radical black tradition would say you have to have those people in the room. And not just in the room, but then you're going to disagree with what they're saying. And you're going to have to keep disagreeing and talking about, that's where the conversation perhaps would be useful. But to have a conversation amongst people for whom the stakes are actually not that big, I think keeps from getting anything done. And I will say this, I hate to be the type of scholar who is like, well, I don't know how that would work out, right? I don't really care, because I'm just writing about the past. But I would say that, I don't have answers to these questions. I don't think many people have answers to these questions, else we would have discovered it by now. But I do think, when we start to actually really center black communities in all their diversity, and that means all their diversity, so it might not be, if you're a liberal white person, the black person who you see every day, who you invite to have this conversation, that might not be the person who you should be in conversation with, right? Having a real conversation, I think that is of value to actually have some type of radical liberatory change.
I want to shift gears a little bit to talk about, there are a lot of questions here about the international aspects of black radicalism. And, you mentioned about the connections with anti-capitalist movements, anti-colonial movements, and even anti-war movements. And I was wondering if you could just say a bit more, I think they were inviting you to say a bit more about how you see that connection, kind of the local arguments that you're making, connecting to these global arguments. And I'll add, what's distinctive about New England in that space?
Well, I think one of the distinctive things about the region is that you have always had a black community that is transnational in scope. So it means something that in 2024, and my colleagues at Tufts who hear me say this all the time, I apologize because I'm going to say it again, but it's 1/3 of all black people in Greater Boston today in Greater Boston are foreign-born, right? And so that means that you have always had a black community for whom transnational consciousness has always been, right? So it's not a new thing that you have a school that has all black students in Everett and the majority of those students are from Haiti or from Ethiopia or from the Dominican Republic, right? That's not a new thing in New England, and it's actually gone way, way back to the 18th century. And so my argument would be that's actually a powerful thing that has often caused the black community, by virtue of that demographic fact, to look beyond its own borders for answers to these radical questions. So for instance, somebody like Eugene Gordon, who was born in Florida, then moved to Louisiana, and then came to Boston, where he attended Boston University, as he is working for New Masses, the people who he's getting most of his radical ideas from are Caribbean migrants in the 1920s, specifically from Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad. And it's those people for whom he is turning to ask questions about what is the role of labor and what does capitalism look like, right? Similarly with William Worthy. William Worthy grew up, and actually the Harvard connection is big. He's a Harvard guy as well. William Worthy grows up in Boston in a black community in which all of his family, kin are black people who are born either in Cape Verde, in Jamaica, or in Trinidad. That's kind of his consciousness when he's just a child growing up in the South End. And so my argument would be that in and of itself, it doesn't mean that those people are Trinidadian, it doesn't mean that those people are Cape Verdean, but it does mean that there's a different way of looking at blackness in those communities that is already a transnational argument. I would also argue that the people that I focus on in the book, I'm really using them as a vehicle to look at that dynamic. Mm-hmm. The fact that you have a black community in New England, in which when you're talking about rights, say in the 1920s, if a good proportion of black people who are talking about rights in the 1920s in New England, if they're coming from Jamaica, or if they're coming from Cape Verde, or if they're coming from Haiti, mm-hmm. they're having a slightly different conversation than somebody who is African American coming from, say, North Carolina, right? Again, it doesn't mean that they're somehow better or against each other. It just means it's slightly different. So my argument would be that because you have that dynamic within the black community and these black figures to begin with, they're automatically engaging in a global way, and they're thinking about capitalism in a global way. And so for as provincial as New England is and can be, one of the things that I'm hoping to explore in the book is that the black community traditionally has not been, right? And traditionally has had a lot of conversations across national lines, and has the way that they're talking about rights are slightly different and have always been sort of conceptualized in a global context.
I'm gonna try to, we got 2 minutes. I'm gonna try to sneak in 2 questions.
Yeah,
all right?
Will they turn us off after the 2 minutes?
So one is, there's one from the audience that says, what are your thoughts about black liberals who might agree in theory with black radical outcomes or goals or dreams, but decide to collaborate with white liberals to achieve incremental change? So examples include figures like Thurgood Marshall, Constance Baker Motley, numerous post-VRA elected officials.
Yeah, I think that that's a valid political route to delivering for communities in the system in which we currently all live. So we live in a democratic political system in which the ways you get something done is through the process that we've set up. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't say that this is an argument to say those people are wrong and somehow, burn them at the stake or whatever, and that's an invalid way of engaging politically. I would say that a radical black ethos pushes both black liberals and white liberals kind of to see things, if they allow it, slightly differently, right? You might have somebody like an Edward Brooke,
I was thinking of Ed Brooke,
who's a Republican senator here in Massachusetts, who, centrist, elected as a Republican. He's listening to the things that black radical, particularly students in Cambridge and Boston, were saying. And that has an effect on the way he then reacts, despite the fact that he himself might not agree with their radical sentiments, right? And so part of the value of this radical black tradition is that it has the effect that it can change and influence policy, as much as we might say that policy itself might not be radical enough, but it can kind of move the needle in a direction, right? And then the project, because it's not Edenic, the project then is for those radicals to then shift the way they then continue the fight going forward. if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. And I think if this conversation is any indication, your book will also shift a lot of the conversations we're having about New England at a time where I think those regional identities are becoming much more salient, and people are going to be trying to think hard about what it means to be committed to liberalism, to try to govern a region in distinction from what's going on in the rest of the country. So your work is very vital, and as always, you are extraordinary.
Oh, thank you, Brandon.
I want to thank you for your wonderful presentation and all that you shared, your wisdom. I also want to thank our audience online and in person for their terrific questions. We'll have plenty more to follow up. I hope you'll be able to join us, everyone, for other Radcliffe virtual programs. You can always find out about future programs and watch videos of past events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. It's always up, it's always ready for your engagement. Thank you for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Round of applause for Kerri Greenidge.
Oh, thank you, Brandon. Great.